Leaving Cleveland behind were two vibrant presidential candidates, Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who pleaded the case of the common man, and William McKinley, a Republican backed by big money. In 1896, big money won. Number 25, William McKinley, Republican, 1897 to 1901, 54 years old, from Ohio.
McKinley is very interesting, I think, to anybody today, especially, because there are some important parallels between the McKinley administration and the administration of George W. Bush. There certainly was a sense in McKinley's day that corporate America had taken control of political America, and many people feel that way today.
He's also somebody who's a bit puritanical, very religious, bringing a morality of approach into politics, but sees that America has to have a new role in the world.
In an era of big personalities, McKinley was short, modest, and had a face some described as a mask of calm. His tranquil demeanor caused many to underestimate him. In truth, McKinley was much more dynamic. He brought with him to the executive mansion a new corporate sensibility and efficiency.
One reason William McKinley was an interesting president is he really pioneered a modern management of the press. It was the McKinley administration that figured out how to give stories to the press, how to feed the press, how to keep the press informed, and they really did all the 20th century stuff on the eve of the 20th century.
Yet McKinley couldn't control the sensational stories now being published in the newspapers about Cubans suffering under the brutal regime of the Spanish Empire. Cuba was one of Spain's colonies, as were Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines.
Cubans had been fighting for their independence for a number of years. There had been a long-running, long-sputtering rebellion, and the Spaniards, in trying to stop it out, they used means such as concentration camps.
McKinley was not opposed to going to war, but he was reluctant. He was the last president to have fought in the Civil War, and his first-hand experience of bloodshed taught him to believe it should be the option of last resort. Yet newspaper reports of human suffering in Cuba, coupled with events abroad, made war look inevitable to many Americans.
American attitudes that led up to the Spanish-American War, in certain respects, were parallel to American attitudes leading up to the war against Iraq in 2003. In that, there were humanitarian reasons for going to war against Spain, just as against Iraq. The Spanish colonial government of Cuba was abusing and oppressing the Cuban people. There was no question about that.
It was also a time when the great nations of the world were building empires, and there was a growing fear that if the United States didn't start taking colonies, it would risk being overpowered.
There was a group, in the Republican Party especially, that even before the opportunity arose to go to war against Spain, had been looking for a way, looking for an excuse, if you want to call it that, for the United States to claim military bases overseas, naval bases overseas, territories overseas, to expand American military power in the Caribbean, in the Pacific.
Equally important was America's appetite for foreign resources.
Americans wanted to have economic relations with Cuba. They didn't want its crops to just be going only to Spain. They wanted American companies to develop them and profit from them. So it was a combination of idealism and concern and self-interest.
And so those people who looked at a map of the world, folks like Theodore Roosevelt in the Navy Department, who could be likened, for example, to Paul Wolfowitz, the #2 man in the Defense Department. These were folks who thought in very broad terms, and they had this notion that the United States could expand its power for the welfare of the United States and, frankly, for the welfare of the world.
Theodore Roosevelt was McKinley's Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and his opposite, an obstreperous, controversial character who hungered for war with Spain.
He was probably the most influential person in America regarding American foreign policy. And if a single person pushed the United States into war against Spain, it was Theodore Roosevelt.
Although McKinley remained wary at the prospect of battle, he agreed to send a warship to Cuba to protect American interests there. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine mysteriously exploded, killing 267 servicemen. Although no one knew what had caused the explosion, the public outcry made it nearly impossible for McKinley to resist going to war with Spain. On the 25th of April, 1898, America declared war on Spain. Roosevelt resigned his executive position and organized a volunteer regiment known as the Rough Riders to fight in the war.
Most people thought Theodore Roosevelt was at least mildly unhinged to make this decision. But for personal, temperamental reasons, Roosevelt had to fight.
With an easy victory over Spain, America became an imperial power, taking possession of Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. That the USS Maine was probably sunk by an accidental engine room explosion and not by a Spanish mine was not known for many years. The war bolstered the economy, and the country was on an upswing as it entered the 20th century. McKinley's running mate was none other than Theodore Roosevelt, put there by some Republicans who wanted to neutralize his growing power. The ticket won, but very soon a tragedy would turn America upside down. New York to take in the sights and give a speech. Among the crowd of well-wishers was Leon Czolgosz, an unemployed factory worker and self-described anarchist who was enraged at the disparity between the rich and the poor.
He just went through the receiving line, and he had a bandaged hand as if he'd hurt it, and there was a pistol in it, and he just came up to the president, and instead of shaking his hand, he killed him.
Americans were aghast at the third presidential assassination in 36 years, and they deeply mourned their fallen leader. Although he had been taken prematurely, William McKinley had already left a remarkable legacy. He had presided over an era of significant change in the nation, but an even greater transformation was about to begin.